Welcome again to all of the participants at our EuroScience Policy Forum. It is now my opportunity to present to you our first session. Our session is entitled, Who Are Your Peers? Expert Evaluation in the Age of Transdisciplinarity. Thanks to all for your interest in the general topic of our policy forum this year, and in the specific topic on how to approach the essential issues involved in research, evaluation, and assessment. During this session, we will attempt to examine existing current practice in academic assessment and explore possible future paths to more inclusive expert evaluation regarding research quality, relevance, methods, outcomes, and impact. Evaluations and assessments involving expert peer review are used in many situations in academic life, including recruitment of research and teaching faculty, decisions regarding promotion and career development, selection of proposed scientific articles for publication, and approval of grant applications for scientific project funding. Traditionally, expert evaluation has involved peer review performed by like-minded colleagues in targeted narrow subdisciplines with particular emphasis on originality, state-of-the-art, and excellence in research methods and analysis. More recently, however, the academic community has been forced to faced with new assessment challenges related to the very nature of 21st century research. On the one hand, the increasing multi, inter, or even transdisciplinarity involved in academic research, and on the other hand, growing concerns regarding the relevance, integrity, and societal impact of the research topics themselves. One might ask, therefore, how the academic community should integrate, associate, or include expert opinions from scientists not in the narrow field of study, but also in neighboring or connected fields, and more generally, how to take into account the opinions of non-experts among interested and concerned parties regarding relevance and impact. To discuss these challenges, I have with me here today 4 panelists who can provide us with their perspectives, following which we will open the floor to exchange with those connected virtually to enlarge our debate. So my panelists are Véronique Alouin. She is currently Secretary General of the funding agency FNRS for the French-speaking part of Belgium, an agency that supports basic and strategic research. She is also currently president of the European Science Foundation Science Connect. Melanie Martel is the founder and CEO of EuroScience, an organization harnessing the power of science and technology to generate positive impacts for people and the planet. Dr. Jonathan Best currently oversees research and analysis and leads research activities leading to decision-making for allocation of research funding and peer review at the Wellcome Trust in Great Britain. And Mostafa M. Shavra is the chair of the Marie Curie Alumni Association since 2020. After working over 10 years in an academic environment in Austria, Belgium, and Netherlands, he recently moved into industry and currently manages several European R&D projects. So I'd like to start our discussion by asking each of our panelists to make a very, very short message of three or four minutes on a specific point of interest to them and with their expertise and experience. And I'd like to start with Véronique Alouin. Véronique, can you provide us in 3 minutes or 4 minutes with your view on the current and future challenges to peer review in the specific area of research project funding and selection, and more generally? So Véronique, you can open up your microphone.
Thank you. I think it's open. You hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. When dealing with the evaluation of, first, we are all aware of the current and growing challenges of traditional peer review in selecting research projects for funding. So mainly overburdened system and experts, excessive use of bibliometric factors, inherent conservatism, and also potential conscious or unconscious bias. But when we deal with the evaluation of transdisciplinary research projects, those challenges are present, but there are other challenges in addition. When designing large transdisciplinary research, researchers together with other professionals have to address a wide array of issues that transcend the traditional scientific considerations. So researchers, funders, and other actors are still, of course, in need of insight into research quality, but research quality needs to be viewed in a broader context, and commonly used practices for evaluation of scientific research do not fit all the goals. Currently, I think there are no widely established and approved criteria and procedures to evaluate transdisciplinary research projects. It was stated in the OECD STI for Science Technology Industry, policy paper published 1 year ago and entitled Addressing Societal Challenges Using Transdisciplinary Research. So however, at FNRS, my funding agency, we think about these challenges and we can try to draw some rules of operations. So rule number 1, of course, the funding instrument. A specific funding instrument for transdisciplinary research must be clearly designed and defined. So for instance, longer project funding periods could be considered, as well as the involvement of the non-academic actors throughout the research processes, and also co-funding scheme. The rule number 2, the panel. Obviously, transdisciplinary proposal must not compete with conventional ones, and the merits cannot be assessed by monodisciplinary panels that lack experience in transdisciplinarity and do not understand its requirement. So a specific panel must be set up, and ideally, it should interview the applicants. The rule number 3, the experts. The specificity of the funding instruments and of the evaluation criteria must be clearly explained to the remote experts and to the members of the panel. And of course, the panel should be composed of transdisciplinary experts, or at least experts who have demonstrated in the course of the career a concern for intersectoriality and a marked interest in research other than that belonging to the discipline. A few non-academic actors and other stakeholders of the research could be involved, but with due regard to potential conflicts of interest. And the rule number 4, the evaluation criteria, and here it's really important to clearly define a toolbox of quantitative and qualitative indicators to assess the quality of the proposal. So here, instead of looking back and focus on past performances only, we need indicators that look forward in the future. And as a central aim of transdisciplinary research is to achieve socially relevant outcomes, of course, some focus must be put on the relevance of the research problem and on the effectiveness of the outcomes and the potential impacts of new knowledge on solving societal problems. And I would like to finish, I would like to add that the transdisciplinary character of a research project must not only be well evaluated, but also, and above all, the added value of transdisciplinarity must be well established and validated so as to avoid evaluating projects that would only integrate the transdisciplinary dimension to mask a weakness or to give into a trend or give the impression of being original. The evaluation must also be able to detect this as early as possible. And last but not least, due to the complexity of transdisciplinary research, of course, the progress of research should be monitored during the research with specific ex durante indicators. I think I've used up my 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Veronique. I'd like to now give the floor to Jonathan Best. Jonathan from the Wellcome Trust. You know, you're involved at the Wellcome Trust in thinking about these issues. Can you provide us also with your view on the most important issues facing evaluation and assessment practice from the perspective of a private foundation concerned by the relevance and impact of the research it funds? So, Jonathan.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael, and thanks for the. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yep, great. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me. So I'm probably going to follow along on a similar vein to Veronique, actually, and because just from an interesting statistics point of view, the UNESCO Institute have sort of said, you know, about $2 trillion is spent globally on research and development, and yet I think as a sector we do not still fully understand what actually works. Certainly from a private research funders perspective, you know, we want to fund in the most fair, effective and efficient way and maximize the impact of our investments in research. So I think for me there are a number of areas which are very similar to the ones Veronique has raised, and you know, particularly in relation to peer review and an increasing need for cross-disciplinary nature of research. And I'm just going to go through sort of 5 which are quite close to my heart at the moment. So really think about who is reviewing, and for us as funders, it's not just about remote written peer reviewers, but it's also about committees and panels and sort of how they interact and who is actually on those panels. And there was a recent Publins report which just said, 4% of reviewers are actually conducting about 25% of grant reviews. So I think, from our own sort of internal investigation, we've tried to rethink about what a peer reviewer is and what constitutes an expert, and that it's not just based around people of similar fields or seniority. And I think as a sector, I'd like to think how we understand better about the diversity of our reviewer community as well, and who we really need reach out to. And I think I would put a challenge out there for the research and reviewer community about being more accessible and being available to review. Then the second area really is about what is being reviewed. So, we're asking reviewers to assess applicants' credentials, research proposals, along with facilities available and project cost and data management. There's a lot of things that we're asking them. We've funded a project which has been undertaken by Gail Valle-Turanjo's team at Kingston University, and they found that reviewers really feel uncomfortable about making assessments outside of their expertise and yet still feel compelled to do that. And so I think, particularly as funders, but generally we should be asking reviewers and researchers to really only evaluate those elements within their expertise and think about getting other experts in, like, for example, project managers, to review things like costs to make sure they're okay. And then, last two are really, how are the reviews being conducted? And really it's being clear on what we ask reviewers to assess. I think we need to get away from just this sort of track record idea and then allowing people to interpret what that means. Equally, as a research community, I think we need to move away from things like publications as an easy measure of quality and think more creatively about how to assess the outcomes of research. And it was actually very pleasing for me just to read this morning that the University of Utrecht has actually tried to pioneer and move away from journal impact factors. So I think, again, that's a challenge for us all to get on board and look at those different ways of assessing quality. And then finally, I'll just sort of, which is something very much for the Wellcome perspective, is enabling a kinder research community and a kinder research culture. And we're working with Gemma Derrick, looking at how feedback from peer reviewers can send signals to researchers, particularly early career researchers, about encouraging them to carry on with their research, even though, and especially when they may have not been successful first time. So I think that's the challenge for us all, and particularly the community. When we talk about the reviewer community, it's like this separate, devoid entity from the research community, but we're actually one of the same. And so I think there's an idea to support not only decision making for grants in our case, but also to support fellow researchers.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Jonathan. I'd like now to ask Melanie Martel. Melanie, you're working in the area of collaborative research and how that can help and impact. Can you provide us with your views on how expert evaluation and assessment can be used in the area of collaborative research aimed at maximum societal impact, and how the concept of societal accountability of the academic scientific community should be integrated into the process? You can put on your microphone and tell us a little bit about that. Thank you, Melanie.
Michael, thanks. Well, I'd like to go back first to the question, who are your peers? I think it's a really relevant question because most of the time we think of scientific peers. So of course, the people that are in your field and that can assess the quality of your method, the quality of the research work you are doing. But I think this question is extremely important if we do not just look at the review, the question of the review of a paper you might write, but also thinking about when you see your peers differently. And for example, if you integrate part of the beneficiaries in your peers or part of a larger society in your peers, then you can start also to think not only of the review of paper or of a research that you would apply for a grant for, but also the question of the production of science, the production of research, and its valorization. And you have to know that, for example, in France, it's only 1% of all the scientific research that is co-created with some sort of external, for example, with citizens or with association collectives of citizens. And so I think this question of who are your peers is extremely important, not only to review the quality, but also to think about what we produce in research, how and what we valorize. And so it's not only about quality, but also about relevance. And to give you a few examples, for example, you could think of when you're working on an algorithm for facial recognition, you could have a very deep, good review of the way you do it, and is it scientifically sound? Is it a good method that you're applying, etc., etc. And you could end up with a very good review and saying that what you're doing is extremely good, and not realizing that there might be bias in what you're doing that will be detrimental to a certain part of the population, but maybe it's not something you've been looking at. And so there are two ways of thinking about that. You could say, well, as the academy, we should train ourselves and we should be more focused on the question of social justice, bias, etc. But you could also say that it's extremely hard to be trained on every question that a society might be interested in. And it would be a bit easier maybe to just consider that among your peers is actually the rest of the society, and that they could give you insights that are really interesting regarding your research question, regarding the impact of what you're doing. And so that's really the way we try to look at that. And maybe I will finish with that, but within EuroScience, in the program that we launch, very often we look for experts to collaborate together. And we say something that might look very strange in today's academia, but we often say to people, you are also an expert of your own experience, and that is valuable. And that can really enrich the scientists and the research. It is very true if you think of medical research, for example, where we've been asking for a patient what was their experience. And actually, I do believe that these kind of approaches are very interesting, not only in medical or in health field, but across all research areas. The last point, and I will end on that, is a question that I think it is important for the academia, and it's why this is interesting for the scientist and for the researcher. And so I guess we will be able to discuss a bit about that in the discussion, but for me, it really enrich what you are doing, and it can also lead to research questions that you would not have thought about. And that's extremely interesting also on a scientific point of view.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I'd like now to give the floor to Mostafa. Mostafa is someone who's been in academia for about 10 years, who is now the chair of the Marie Curie Alumni Association, where there are a large number of postdoctoral fellows or previous postdoctoral fellows. And now that you've moved on and you have a position in a different sector, in the business sector, I'd like to ask you how you see the future of evaluation and assessment practice in academia for research and teaching faculty at all career stages and from varying geographic and disciplinary backgrounds. And we could add to that, including research and teaching faculty who in their careers will leave academia to go to other sectors. How do you define a peer, and how can we open how can open and unbiased evaluation and assessment in academia be assured? This is a kind of a reference to what Melanie is talking about as well. Can we open up the notion of peers to something a little bit different from what we have done in the past? Is it helpful, and how does it interact with careers? So Mostafa.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here and listen to all of you. In a lot of cases, there were some similar thoughts. So if I look at your first question, which is basically about the future of evaluation and assessment practice in academia, I mean, let's take a step back. If we look at the current academic system, we know that it needs a serious reform. And researcher evaluation system is actually one of the components which needs to be revamped. There were several initiatives taken in the past years to address these challenges in evaluation and assessment system. There are studies, recommendations from organizations working in higher education sectors such as DORA, European Universities Association, CESAR, Science Europe, Dutch Universities Association. They really made a lot of recommendations, but the core message is simple. The core message is academic career assessment practice should become more open, more transparent, and responsible. I mean, there are really good examples how the, Jonathan just mentioned today, I was also wanted to mention this, how Utrecht University officially announced that they are basically coming out of the impact factor age. And in fact, the Dutch Universities Association have a different assessment system right now. So to answer your question in kind of a holistic view, I would say that I see a future where a proper researcher evaluation system would be implemented, where we value responsible research and innovation, where we reward and incentivize the practice of open science, and ensure that evaluation is valid and, most importantly, applicable across discipline and sector. It's a difficult job. Understand what role various role researchers play and include them in the researcher evaluation system, including leadership, including collaboration, but most importantly, including peer review. Now come back to the second part of your question regarding peer review. I mean, we know that the whole academic world has changed over the year. I mean, the academic world in last 20 years has a completely different research culture than right now. So in terms of peer review, in my personal opinion, what I have seen in academia and in industry, we do need to reinvent the wheel. And why? Because if you look at the peer review, probably this is one of the sector or one of the part in academia which is most neglected in terms of training. Is there a training you can, I mean, other than Pavlon, which recently started, but is there a training initiative which really professionally, or not professionally, which trained the early career researcher or evaluator? No. So we first need to provide training so that we can reduce the bias in peer review. Then we need to experiment different models. It could be double blind, it could be open peer review, or it could be combination of preprint and open peer review. As Melanie was mentioning, I mean, it's not only the researcher, it's the experience of the researcher, but also there are different other stakeholders whose opinion could be really valued in the peer review. So what we have seen in COVID-19, basically, that this preprint, the combination of preprint and open peer review system, where we see that the researcher uploads that and then the stakeholder researcher gives the feedback and then researcher submits it. I think there was also a story where one of the important paper was not in preprint and the scientific community was not happy about it. So I see a future where open peer review would be the main driving force, and we'll be using the preprint services and will take over the traditional peer review. So this is just my short intervention, and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Mostafa. Now to open up to some of the questions. Now we have received a couple of questions in the chat, and one of them I think would be very interesting for each of the four panelists to address. Mostafa began addressing it slightly. He said that things have changed over the last 20 years, but at the same time, he seemed to indicate that although things have changed, many things still remain to be adapted. The question, let me just, can I roll up here the chat? It says in the chat, could we drop the term tradition in this context, please? The landscape looked much different 30 years ago. We are dealing with fashion, not tradition. Now, you may be aware, those of you who are online, that we have a second session this afternoon following this one, which is actually called Research Culture. and which addresses the question of the cultural aspects of our scientific academic communities. And I think then this question about whether what we are trying to accomplish is fashion, which then means that it varies from one period to another without perhaps changing fundamentally what is happening with respect to some sort of traditions which need to be examined in their historical perspective, and then to think about whether or not they are appropriate and how they have changed over time. So I guess in this question, we're addressing both how have things changed over the last 30 years, and how much are we really addressing the issues as they are, and not just, I would say, trends and fashionable things that look good to do for the moment, and that maybe in a couple of years will no longer seem to us to be so important. So since Mostafa, you began talking about this, why don't you start by trying to address that very difficult question of how do things change over time?
Yeah, it is indeed quite a difficult question. I mean, what I have seen, or what I understand in over 12 years in academia, so it's the research culture. Even when I was a PhD, the open science was really not, the open science movement have not started that much. Yeah. So if we look at a broader view, what has changed? We see that there are more transdisciplinary research right now, which we all panelists have been mentioned. We have seen that there are more international collaboration. It's not about your own work, how you teamwork, how you make a team, how you collaborate with not only in terms of the different scientific fields, but also the geographical, you remove the geographical barrier. And then when we are talking about the publication system or everything, it's basically open science is just now rising. But I think one of the biggest takeaway from what changed in the last 30 years is that we understand that impact factor or traditional publication system, I'm not really saying generally, but traditional evaluation metrics, what we use to assess researcher, to publish publish in the journals, do not work at all. Yeah. So we need to, that's why we really need to reinvent. In fact, there was a study from, I think from one of the organizations, which basically says that the high impact factor, the journals which are published in high impact factor journal has really less impact. So how are we measuring impact? So we are asking this question. So this is the biggest change, I would say, apart from the others just mentioned. And overall understanding that the whole research culture of the current European open science landscape or in the world needs to be changed. And we really have good examples across the continent. I had the pleasure to see the Latin American open science movement. This is incredible how they actually practice open science. So my understanding would be there are a lot of things, a lot of issues which needs to be changed, but we are realizing that we just need to act upon that.
Could I ask you, Mostafa, just very quickly to address this question about the difference between tradition and fashion?
Well, yeah.
Yes,
sorry.
But yes, I wanted to ask you if you could address the question of this question between what are changes with respect to traditional practice? What does it mean to just be fashionable?
Well, that's a good question. In academic perspective, I would say that publishing in high impact factor journal was kind of a tradition. Yeah. And I just hope that publishing it open science is not a fashion. It will still be there. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay.
Maybe I can add something on that.
Melanie, a remark on this?
Yeah, because I think there are two things interesting. The first one is change in itself is not an issue, because when we talk about fashion, we might also say that it's negative. It's something that is here and then it will pass, and everything changes and nothing changes. But we have to ask the question: what are our challenges? We need to change for certain reasons, because what we were doing is not working in our current context. Maybe it was working 30 years ago, maybe it's no more working. So it's not changes for the changes, but it's always related to certain challenges that we want to address. So I think that's one point that is very important. Then the second thing is, indeed, is it a fashion? When I was talking about citizen participation, for example, I've seen a lot of research institutes or university really investing that field, and absolutely 30 years ago it was not the same, or at least the discourse around that was not the same. So things are changing in that sense. But then sometimes you hear also some research institutes talking about citizen participation because what they are really thinking about is acceptance, for example, of the technology. And will the public be reluctant or not with things that we develop? And when you think like that, then you're not really changing the underlying hypothesis or the underlying culture of how and why science is being deployed. And so I think that's when the risk of fashion exists, is when you as an institution, you try to use words, you try to use concepts that are new or that you need to implement, but you are not actually changing really the models that you act upon. And so for me, if you don't want to enter into just a fashion that will pass, it's really about changing the culture and not just using new methodologies. But why are you doing that?
Thank you, Melanie. Maybe Veronique, since you've been running a research funding agency for quite a while now, do you think you could address this question of how the landscape has changed over the last 30 years? And what do we mean by landscape, actually?
Oh, well, yes, there is a important change from different point of view. First, you have much more, a very higher number of researchers, much more international. So the competition is much tougher. This is one difference. Another difference is the development of IT influence. Of course, it helps researchers doing quicker, faster, and better, but it influenced the work of the evaluation assessment, because it's so easy now to count the citations, the publications, the impact, and so on, H-index. And when you count something, when you measure an activity, the outcome of an activity, you influence the activity, because the researchers, of course, want to publish more and more. So in a sense, you influence the activity of research because you measure it in a certain way and too easily. This is a big change, I think. There's also, of course, now for 10 years, maybe we speak about publish or perish. I think 30 years ago, publish or perish was not fashionable, if I can say so. And another difference also is there's some aspect of fashion, I must say, because there is, I think there is not only one research that must be funded. We need money for basic research without any consideration of outcome, because you will have an outcome, but the scale, the time scale can be very big. But you will have an outcome also by just training young people that will transfer the knowledge in another landscape after. So we need to have money for basic research, and we need to fund strategic research and transdisciplinary research. And you can have this different system coexisting depending on your funding instruments, your evaluation procedure and system, and your criteria of evaluation will be different, but you don't have just one size for all. You see, I think this is very important. And currently, more and more money is available for strategic or transdisciplinary research. In a sense, there is some fashion there. Of course, it's very relevant. It's very relevant to try to address societal challenges, of course. But more and more money, when the politics increase the budget of research, of course, it will be 100% now, presently 100% for transdisciplinary or strategic research, I think.
Okay.
I don't know if it answers your question, but this
Well,
was my...
we have a variety of questions in the chat, and I'd like to give the floor back to Jonathan about something which just came up in the chat, but which is similar to a question that came up earlier. Earlier in the chat, there was a question about whether we should be assessing and evaluating applicants or proposals. And this comes back to the question of track record and things like that. And whether we should be looking and how we should be looking at the alignment of assessment and the funding schemes. And what has recently come up in the chat just a few seconds ago was a question about what I would say is the overall, I would say, Holy Grail of evaluation, which says, you know, I just read the question, could we somehow examine the impact, both short-term and long-term, of research in terms of societal, economic, and sustainability changes? You know, I mean, I call this the Holy Grail because it, of course, would imply that in an ex-ante evaluation, you could determine those ex-post impacts. And even in an ex-post evaluation, you could determine those impacts in some unambiguous way. And I know there's been a lot of work, in particularly in the UK, Jonathan, regarding these trajectories of impact, looking actually not at impact in a statistical way, but looking at it more in a qualitative way. How have the various research projects led to changes? Can you talk a little bit about how the Wellcome Trust is looking at this? Because I know you're interested in these questions of objective-driven research, but of course, this begs the question of how do we know whether we achieved anything? Yeah?
Now, I think that's an excellent question, really. I think it's one that we tussle with quite a lot, as certainly as a private funder, but I think as a funder, the sector as a general. I think, you know, it's sort of starting out with what do we mean by impact? And I think that's what a lot of people are asking. And we've sort of moved away from using that terminology a bit more towards thinking about research benefits. And then I think when you think about benefits, you can think about who is being benefited. And therefore, it allows you to then think about the research community being benefited in terms of knowledge and in terms of sort of innovation. And then you can think about other groups, such as patient groups or sort of policy groups who are benefited from the kind of information and evidence that's come out. So I think, you know, we're trying to tussle with this idea of impact, therefore how you show that then. And then just, you know, I think one point Veronique raised, which I think is the key thing, is it's that future projection, which is, as we know from a lot of research, one of the most difficult things to do. And we often base future projections on past performance, which then brings into this idea of what constitutes a track record, which again, as a lot of the early career researchers will know, is very difficult to sort of determine, because a lot of early careers do not have a track record, whatever that is. And I think what we've got to think about then is when we look at proposals and when we look at applicants, it will very much depend on the context in which we're assessing it. So my personal view is that most of our assessments should focus on the proposal, because again, research, particularly from Canada, has shown that if you focus on a proposal, there is no disadvantage between men and women. Whereas if you look at track record and you look at sort of the research career, if you like, actually they found that there was a slight bias towards men. And again, so we've got to think about what it is we're assessing and the impact of what we're assessing. So for me personally, I think it's about the proposal, it's about the idea. And when we were talking about fashions earlier, I think about that as, you know, emerging areas and the innovation that the community can bring out. And that then entails a bit of risk taking from our reviewers to say, well, actually, this sounds like a really fascinating area, or this could change the landscape quite significantly. and therefore push those kind of ideas versus the more traditional ideas that people feel more comfortable reviewing or understand a lot more about. So I think, you know, there's a balance to be had, but I would like to see more sort of assessments around the proposals and the idea, particularly for early research careers. And then thinking about the applicant, it's, you know, what have they done to determine that they can deliver on? And that's not necessarily about the institution they're at. It's not necessarily about who their supervisor is, although obviously those types of context are really important in supporting that individual. But again, it's like, what ideas have they had? Why have they come to those conclusions? So I think we should sort of change a little bit the way we think about researchers and a little bit about how we place the weight on the proposals versus the applicants, for instance.
Thank you, Jonathan. Maybe come back to Mustafa. I see a couple of questions coming up on the chat concerning indicators. And I think one of the issues, and many of the questions in the chat concern the fact that assessment procedures should be open, they should be transparent, they should be unbiased, they should allow us to look at various things. And but one word that has not yet appeared in the chat, unless I missed it, is the word fair. and I think that the research community is pretty sensitive to that. And so this question about indicators, and perhaps unambiguous indicators, is probably something that's a concern. Maybe the Marie Curie Alumni Association has been trying to grapple with this as well, because the more qualitative we are, the more open we are, the more transdisciplinary we are, the more we may give the impression, at least to some of our colleagues, that we're being a little bit arbitrary. So Mustafa, how do we grapple with this? It seems like it's a little bit contradictory somehow.
It is, I mean, the truth is evaluating interdisciplinary research is really challenging. I mean, especially right now, there are emerging of new fields. It's really difficult to find the reviewer. There is no proper coordinated or approved indicators. I mean, there are good examples, of course. For example, ERC uses high risk, high gain, and I think in their synergy call, if I remember, that there are about 77% applicants were actually interdisciplinary. So there are good examples how ERC are doing it, but again, there is no coordinated effort. There are a lot of recommendations from, I think, from Science Europe publications on the researcher career assessment. So when we are talking about, I mean, we need to see the overall, we really need to weigh the positive and the negative of each different evaluation system. Now, if we go to open and transparent, there are already study which says that the evaluators are not truthful enough. I mean, they take a step back. But then how do we really ensure that either it's a paper or a proposal researcher get open feedback? And here comes the use of not only the open peer review, but rather engaging with the community, with the peer service, preprint services, because there are so many researchers working on diverse area of the field. You will get somehow the reply. And in our association, what we have seen in the past, I mean, apart from being that we are a vocal supporter of the open science and Plan S movement, we believe that really, I mean, as I said, there are pros and cons, and we really need to see how we deal with these challenges with the interdisciplinary research. Where we really find out the indicators. What are the indicators? I mean, for example, one person actually mentioned in the chat that novelty of the project. So this is really important. Also, Jonathan mentioned that let's evaluate the proposal, not the researcher. I would personally slightly add there, I would still would like to see if the researcher or the team of the researcher will have the capacity to perform that interdisciplinary research. Yeah, so there would be the need to have some kind of maybe the way would be different, but some kind of indicators. But going forward, I think we like it or not, open science is open peer review is the answer. Now we need to find out how we basically tackle with the challenges with the open science. I don't know if that answers your question, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Mostafa. Veronique, I don't know if in the FNRS in Belgium you started thinking about open peer review as an opportunity in some cases, in particular for some of these complex strategic, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary areas, or is it just too far down the road for a traditional?
It's a bit far for us, but what we would like to launch an instrument for very risky projects, and in that case, I would like to test a blind approach, so a selection just based on the proposal, because I know that our colleagues from Switzerland do it for one of the instruments, and they told me that really they see new names, new proposals, just to avoid the star effect, if I can say so, because if you have just focus on the project, but this would be for a specific instrument. If it's a fellowship for PhD, no, there we need, you must really adapt the conditions of your evaluation to the instrument you want to fund, I think.
Melanie, since you work with all kinds of stakeholders of different sorts, do you have an opinion on this, in particular for the academic community, using a variety of peers, as you indicated in your remarks? Is there some way to develop mechanisms or methods or indicators to use with that?
So we have very precise methods on how, and methodology on how we make these people interact. What I think is interesting regarding like what was said in the chat is that what is very true is what kind of indicators can you use when the science you're talking about, of course, the impact and the results, it's something that will happen in the future. And also when you talk about societal impact, it's really difficult to measure. It's really difficult to predict. And so that's very tricky. There are a lot of research projects on that, but it's still not solved. And one way we've been dealing with that is that, so at EuroScience, we do have indicators of the projects or the research that we will follow. And one of those indicators, of course, not the only one, but it's one that we really like to use, and we don't see that used often, is actually to check. So we always work with consortium, with very diverse stakeholders. And we always check what is the consortium made of. So we are looking for a very balanced one. What we really prefer is to have a consortium with scientists, of course, but also private actors, also citizens, also, if it's possible, public authorities that would be part of it. And so one of our indicators is the diversity of the co-creators of the research. That is something that we want to look into because we have a hypothesis. And so it's something that should be maybe questioned, is our hypothesis a good one or not? But our hypothesis is that if you want a research with impact, you need to have the stakeholders that will be impacted inside the creation of the research, of the question that is being posed. And so that's how we see this problem. And so that's why our indicator is like that. But so I think it's really dependent on what you want to do and how you see the goal of your organization. And that's how you're going to choose the indicator that you use.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a very interesting question in the chat that just came by as I mentioned the word fair, and in the chat it was indicated that fair is a subjective and context related, but of course unfair is also subjective and context related. So I think that's there probably is no automatic way of guaranteeing that something is fair, but maybe in a more general sense, Jonathan, since you've been working at different types of methodologies, are there methodologies that are fairer than others? I mean, is it clear that certain types of indicators are less, I would say, yeah, have less of a tendency to create unfair situations or lead to something that nobody has mentioned yet, but which is the question of conflicts of interest and more generally, things that we have seen in many of the very open peer review mechanisms of gaming, actually, of the system. Is that a risk, or is it exaggerated?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question of how you define fair. I mean, I think, you know, particularly at Wellcome, we've been thinking about the researcher community in general and how we encourage the diversity of that community. You know, I think it's well known that, you know, as a community, we're quite sort of restricted in the demographics. We've got the underrepresented groups find it very hard to attain funding and are sort of, you know, developing their careers. But I think we've sort of tried a couple of things, and what's interesting is there are always, you know, pros and cons to them. So I think the idea of an open peer review system is an interesting one, and yet that has shown to be a number of flaws in that, if you know, that there can be often pressure applied to those reviewing if they are more junior than the person who is putting the application in. So again, I think, you know, how that works in terms of a fair kind of assessment is interesting. Also, the idea of you know, all the information being available, such as institution, and as we've been talking about publications. Now, at Wellcome, we definitely do not advocate using journal impact factors, but we do put the publication list there with the idea that it's available to look at the quality of previous research. But I think a lot of investigations have come out to say, do reviewers, or particularly peer reviewers, actually look at the content of those publications to assess the quality, rather than just looking at who you published with, which journals it in, and generally read the abstract, which will be those highlights that the report will bring in. So again, I think, you know, that will obviously frame what they think of that individual and how that individual will progress. So I think there's an issue with that. We've thought about total blind peer reviewing, so it's a double blind thing. I think again that has more benefits to it in terms of a fairer assessment and a fairer approach. We tried it with the Research on Research awards that we did, and there was an interesting mix of, it allowed our committee to really divorce themselves from who was actually conducting the research and think more about the proposal. So much so some people felt uncomfortable about that because they didn't have the context. We did provide a context, but again, it was, I think some people felt very difficult, in a difficult position to be able to assess a proposal when they didn't actually know who was doing it. But the interesting thing that came out of that when we discussed it is there's an issue then of a well-written proposal. And so therefore, what you cannot get rid of, even though you blinded it, is that institutional support and background support to that individual to write a really good proposal. So I think, you know, if we do go down that route, and I do believe there is merit in going down to create a more fair assessment system, so that you're just looking at what is presented to you, the ideas that are presented to you, and then with, as Mustafa said, I think there needs to be some context around what the individual can deliver, but you can do that in a way which is not about the name, not about the institution. And I think, you know, with more training and more support for the applicants, you could arrive at a kind of fairer system. But I think, again, it's one of these things where there are pros and cons to each. And sometimes it's the least worst situation that can occur. And at other times, you know, you try and manufacture the best situation. But equally, I think, you know, peer reviews with some of the other mechanisms, and a lot of the continental European funders have been experimenting with things like lottery funding and other types of mechanisms, which actually, when complemented with peer review, I don't think you ever get rid of that, but when complemented with that, can actually give us an opportunity to increase the fairness, and with that, the diversity of the research population.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that one of the things that's been addressed a little bit in the chat has been also this question of the fact that depending on what you're assessing, the assessment methods and practices should be different. So the diversity is necessary also in the evaluation methodologies. I think the assessment methodologies have to be adapted to what you're trying to do. Of course, Veronique mentioned that you have the fundamental research, the strategic, objective-driven research, and you also have some transdisciplinary research that there are at least 3 categories there that require different methodologies for assessment. But I think probably if we think about it harder, we probably would find a number of different types of situations. One of the chats mentioned very multidisciplinary efforts where you would have, for example, physicists, biologists, and sociologists working on the same project with, of course, that would imply different language systems, different jargon, different research cultural norms, disciplinary norms, etc. That would then require a special adaptation to the assessment method. So I think that we're looking here at some necessity perhaps for biodiversity in all of this. There was a kind of an interesting provocative observation in the chat regarding the fact that while all of us here are putting knots in our heads trying to figure out how to be fair and open and transparent and less statistically based and more qualitative and not using H-index factors and other things, that in the meantime, some of our Asian colleagues have been really pushing very hard, getting themselves into a position of being particularly noticed for the quality of their research on the basis of their H-indexes and other such things. And there was, I saw in the chat, it says it was kind of ironic that we were so successful in convincing people with our bibliometrics that everyone around the world is now using them and we're going to abandon them. So I don't know if maybe it's a free open question to end the session to all 4 panelists just in a minute or two. Are we going in the right direction here in Western Europe, or are we somehow, yeah, I don't know, are we just following some fashionable trend, and or do our colleagues in China or elsewhere have it right and we're getting it wrong? So maybe start with Veronique. What do you think?
No, I think things are not black or white. A bit of some indicators, bibliometric indicators, mean something, but they are not all things. If you have someone with excellent indicator, bibliometric indicators, of course, I guess it's a very good researcher. The problem is that it influenced the behavior of many researchers, not necessarily in the right direction. So we should not totally forget those indicators. So someone getting 30,000 citations, it means something. You see, but if you just consider that, this is wrong, because otherwise you don't need peer. If you just look at the indicators, you just need a computer. It will make the job, but it's quite, it's less expensive for the funding agencies. Great. So I think we maybe we yes, we should not go from black to white or from white to black. We should try to be in a moderate position. Yeah. We take the good of different things.
Even China is already rethinking its position on bibliometrics. Melanie, what do you think about this whole question about, I guess, what can be automated, what cannot be automated, what can be uniform, what cannot be uniform?
Yeah, on that I would agree that it's really hard, and I don't think it's necessary, or I'm not sure we want to automate most of it. There was an interesting question about consortium saying that what happens, like, no matter the indicators you use, at some point, if these indicators are known, maybe some people will just try to tick the boxes. So for example, when I was saying my indicator is to know if within the consortium there are a lot of very different stakeholders, we could have people that decide to apply with a project with all the stakeholders that you need, but actually it's just on paper, and it's just because that's what you need to have the fundings. and that's where I go back to the automatization. I think it's really important that in the evaluation of projects, we are not trying to tick boxes. And so to go back to the way we do things in our process, but it's a very intensive in human resources, what we are doing, but we know very well how the consortiums were created, because it's also part of our methodology. So we are not trying to have I don't know, people that would apply and we don't know exactly who they are, what they do, but it happens that they tick all the boxes, and so we say it's a yes. And indeed, to do that, a computer could do it. But it's much more qualitative than that. It's really about knowing the people, the projects, the consortium. Actually, we've been following them for months before they can apply, and so you could say it's kind of subjective because we know who are these people. And at the same time, I would not like to automize all of it, because you get to really understand what is the purpose of what they're trying to do. And this is very related to our mission at EuroScience. We are interested in the purpose of this research. So for us, it's extremely resource intensive, but I would not want to go towards something using less resource. I mean, there is a reason we need humans sometimes to actually do stuff.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. I'd just like to leave one more minute and give you the closing remark, Mostafa. You know, the early career researchers that you're representing in the Marie Curie Alumni Association are going to be affected by all this. How do you see the future? Is it a bright future or less bright, now that you've heard this discussion and how complex it is?
I mean,
so
just to
be finishing
just to say one point here. First of all, even when we started with the H-index, there were a lot of people who were against it. And I can tell you the Einstein's H-index is only 56. I can tell you that Peter Higgs did even say that he would not get a job in current academic system. So the early career researcher would like to start a completely new system, and it should not be based on H-index, which basically which is literally just a mathematical measurement. So regarding the future, we live in a truly global society. We are interconnected, we are interdependent. So we need to look out for each other. We need to support each other's career. We need to use the evaluation system to motivate and encourage the next generation researcher to co-create meaningful and positive changes. If COVID-19 taught us one thing, we really need to work together. So my suggestion would be working together and enable and help the researchers so that they can do what they do best, innovate solutions for our future challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mostafa. Yeah, I was pushing Melanie and you to speak quickly because I thought we were finishing at 15:15. In fact, we're finishing at 15:30, so we have time to look at one or two more points in the chat. And I think one of the things is the question about what is it that we're trying to accomplish here, and how is the assessment process encouraging or discouraging original thinking and actually useful things that people are doing. And I guess that this comes back to the question of, it comes up frequently in management of anything, where you say that you tend to obtain what you reward. So the assessment process itself tends to lead to behavior changes. What kind of behavioral changes would we be expecting from the researcher community if we changed in the sense of some of the suggestions that have been made regarding open peer review, more transparent peer review, different practices compared to what we have done in the past? Véronique, what do you think? This will be then the final question for each of us. We'll do a roundtable here. Véronique, what do you think would be the changes in the way researchers behave?
I think we should change a little bit the system to focus on quality, and to produce quality you need time. So this would be the changes I would expect give some time to go in depth in and to go in depth in the work and to focus on quality. And so, because I'm sure that the researchers that are selected, the projects that are selected and funded, are most of the time outstanding or excellent. So in a sense, the peer review system enable to identify very good researchers, very good projects, and to fund them, you see. But the problem, I think, that everything is too fast, and researchers don't take time. They want to publish too quickly, and they don't dare to introduce too risky projects, because if the project is too risky, you will not publish enough. And so there is this really a drawback of the current peer review system. So the idea is to try to, how can we change, adapt the peer review system to avoid those drawbacks? This is really, for me, the question, in fact. And of course, as Mustafa said, the challenge different if you look at your early career researcher. You can use different indicators than if you look on research project. I think you should really adapt your indicators and your procedure to what you want to fund. But so the change would be probably those ones, less rush to publish, try more risky proposals. Also, maybe there is a tendency sometimes to focus on thematics that are trendy, because you have more chance to be published in Nature or other ones, because there are some trendy subjects, of course. And so it's also a question of on what people are going to search, on which field, on which subject. This could be also an improvement. And well, I think I will leave time for the other co-panelists to give their statement.
I see in the very last changes, the very last chat entries, that we're talking here about something which is a little bit different from what is a classical publication, but it's this question about how we communicate what we're doing. Is there around the panel anyone who'd like to take up these questions regarding about, I say we need to talk more about communication and less about publication. What do we mean by that, and why is it relevant in this context?
Maybe I can say a few words about that. Of course, I think it's very important to communicate a lot on what is being done in the research field, in science, in labs, because it's very often something that is not very known. Also, if you create knowledge, you want this knowledge to be known, at least maybe, and used even. And so if it's not accessible, it cannot be used. So the question of communication is extremely important. But I would not stop there, because if you communicate, and how do you communicate? Because even if it's wide and if it's accessible, if it's open, it is still somehow the same thinking as publication. If you just do a communication that you put online for people to find, or if you do a conference, even if your results are accessible, it stays in the same idea that you just, it's kind of a top-down relationship. You just give to the world what you did. For me, we have to go much further than communication. It's not just about communication, it's about co-creation of the knowledge. And if you really want people to understand that knowledge, to use it, and to make good use of it, for me, really what you have to do is to co-create this knowledge. And that's where the question of who are your peers is really important, because who are you going to co-create the knowledge with? So that would be what I have to say on this question. Okay,
thank you, Melanie. I think there's a question here around how knowledge is used as well in society on take-up. I see in the chat that there's some questions about how the knowledge is taken forward and how it's used in a more general sense. The question also related to public funding, where we have the question of universal public goods and the fact that knowledge generated and created from public funds should be available openly. This may not be the case in the private sector. So, but in the case of the academic community, we would be expecting that research results would be widely available. That doesn't mean that a non-expert would be able to use them immediately, however, since there are specialized domains where you need to be formed and trained to be able to exploit what is published in the literature. Maybe just to finish up now, because now I'm sure that we will finish on time. Maybe give the final word to Mostafa and then to Jonathan. Finish up with Jonathan as the last word on how we see the researcher community in the future adapting to this new context and the framework. So Mostafa, maybe just a compliment to what you said earlier.
As I said at the beginning, we really need to think about the paradigm shift. The researcher evaluation system, the way we deal with the research and academic different components needs to be really changed and kind of reimagined. And if you'd like to, and how we would do that, I mean, there are really a lot of recommendations, quantitative evaluation, expert assessment, really measure the impact. I mean, we need to ask ourselves why we'd like to do research. What are our goals? And depending on that, and are we allowing the curiosity-driven research or object-oriented research or mix of both? Yeah? What are the impact of those research? So when we can answer these questions, the suggestion is basically pretty straightforward, written in the, for example, in the Hong Kong principle. You really need to, or even the Leiden Declaration, you really need to think about to change significant area of the research culture. The whole research culture community, research culture for the future would be changed. And I'm really looking forward what we will see in the next session. In terms of the evaluation system, it would be really assess the responsible research practices, revert the practice of open science, acknowledge really the broad range of research activities, and recognize the essential task what researchers perform. As long as we can do that, the future we see is more brighter. So thank you.
Thank you, Mostafa. I'll give the final word to Jonathan. I'd just like to thank Mostafa for citing the Leiden Declaration. You know, we've chosen Leiden as the European City of Science 2022 and the central hub for ESOF 2022. So I'd like to remind all of those who are currently connected that we will be following up on many of these subjects, in particular those that regard dialogue and concern dialogue between science and society in many different ways. And I think the choice of Leiden as the central hub for that 10th edition of ESOF is an excellent opportunity to do that. So the final word to you, Jonathan, how is this changing? And maybe the final question to you is kind of a provocative question in line with our overall policy forum. Is it sustainable? Can we do it? Is it sustainable?
Is what so sustainable?
Yeah, are the academic institutions able to survive faced with all of these challenges on assessment, evaluation, impact, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that is an incredibly big question, which I probably won't, in the time I have, be able to answer fully. But I think for me, I think it just to follow on from some of the things Mostafa has. I think we, as a sector, I think the research culture is going to be the key thing. And I think there are lots of different facets of that. But I think for me, the one thing I would bring out was this idea of support. So at Wellcome, we talk about a kind of research culture, and I think that can spill over into assessments, because actually what you've got are reviewers who are researchers assessing applicants who are also researchers. And I think there's something about the way you assess it, but using a supportive language and being able to use constructive language. So actually, you know, what we deal with as many people who are not successful about being able to pursue their research career, but a lot of them have really good ideas. And so I'd like to see something around that. And I think that's around the sustainability of the research system is that the way reviews are done and the way the assessments are done are looked at in a supportive and constructive kind of way. So I'll try and end on a positive note in that sense.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And of course, it's excellent also to show the wonderful coherence of our program for the EuroScience Policy Forum, that we are following up this session number 1 after a 15-minute mingle lounge. For those of you who would like to get to know each other a little bit online, we will start a session number 2 at 15:45 Central European Time. And this session will be dedicated specifically to the question of research culture. So let me thank once again our 4 panelists, and like to thank all of those who are participating. We had over 70 participants in this session asking questions, contributing to the chat. Oh, we get up all the way up to 96 at one point online. So I think this has clearly been a subject which has been of strong interest to everyone. We don't have the answers, but I think we're beginning to ask the right questions.